trees. When they are first planted, they are super tiny.
But after a while, they get bigger and bigger.
Once they start to grow, they sprout branches.
Branches.
Much like regular trees, the evolutionary tree started from one species, like the trunk of this tree.
The animal species that all of the creatures around you started from is a sea sponge.
Whoa! Do you mean to tell me that advanced species like humans started from a sponge?
Yeah,
Well, how did that happen?
Speciation, the formation of new and distinct species in the course of
Evolution.
evolution.
as previously stated, speciation is the process by which one species splits into two or more species. It was first noticed by biologist Charles Darwin when he was doing research in the Galapagos Islands. Speciation fascinated Darwin and many other biologists because it produced a huge diversity of different types of life, each one different from the last one. Speciation also aids in explaining the many features that different organisms share. Because in the process of speciation, when one organism splits into two, the two now different species will share similar characteristics. At the DNA sequence level, these species will share more similar genes and similar strains of nucleotides, the basic structural unit of DNA, which leads to similarities in visible traits or phenotypes. For instance, take this picture of these finches. Each finch shares similar characteristics, but each finch is also noticeably different than the other. In the diagram, each finch ends up having these different features because they are displaying sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is the creation of different species via isolation mechanisms, other than geographical isolation, which means that species do not breed due to some sort of geographical barrier. These isolation mechanisms include species that prefer to eat different things, which is more specifically referred to as behavioral isolationism. These organisms that prefer specific foods tend to group themselves with other organisms of the same species that prefer the same foods, thus shrinking the gene pool and creating new species of animals. Other forms of isolation mechanisms include temporal isolation, mechanical isolation, and ecological isolation. Temporal being that organisms have different mating times, mechanical being that they lack proper reproductive parts, and ecological meaning that they live in different habitats.
Natural selection is one of the key reasons evolution takes place. Natural selection can have very small changes and very big changes, but regardless of how big the change is, it takes course over 1 million years. It doesn't take place over the weekend, guys, come on.
An easy way to understand natural selection is if you have a slightly taller person and a short person both trying to reach for apples that are in a tall tree, and only the slightly taller people can reach it. Then the tall people will outcompete the short people, and further generations will be taller and taller.
In the case of Darwin, when he was studying the Galapagos Islands, he saw that depending on the type of food on the island will determine the dominant species of finch, such as islands that have nuts that are inside hard shells. Finches with big, strong beaks would be best for getting inside that hard shell.
Survival of the fittest is an everyday occurrence. One of the most important things when it comes to survival is the need to get food. To maximize the chance of survival, animals will have adaptations to get food easily. For birds, there are two main components, and that's the type of food that they're trying to get and the type of beak they have. If a bird doesn't have a right beak for them, then they won't be able to survive in the environment they are in.
In this experiment, we'll be testing adaptations that the bird beaks have made over time to increase their fitness in the environment by using different beaks or utensils to pick up trail mix or other kinds of nuts to show which beak is more advantageous to a certain type of food.
First, gather your materials. What you will need is a spoon, 2 chopsticks, and some tweezers. These are representing the bird's beaks. Choose a bird's beak and scatter the assorted nuts into a box or a bowl of food, and we will be picking these up. You will be timed and will pick up one food item at a time in their beak and drop it in the cup. If you drop it, the prey returns to the environment. Each round lasts 30 seconds, and at the end of each round, count and record the number of each type of food gathered.
The chopsticks represent long, narrow beaks, which are great for picking up like large objects, peanuts. They're easy to grab. Other things that are rounded and small are a little bit harder to pick up. Or even smaller nuts like this are pretty hard to grab. This type of beak would be most advantageous with food sources such as these.
The spoons here represent a round-beaked bird, and these are good for picking up items such as the nuts and such as the pecans. Just like the other beak, it's kind of more difficult to pick up these. Like even the small ones are kind of difficult.
The tweezers would represent a bird with a small, narrow beak, and this beak is more advantageous for smaller items like the craisins, but it really has no worth when grabbing large items like the peanuts. So therefore, a bird with this kind of beak would not be successful in an area with larger nuts, but it would be more successful in an area with small pieces.
Peter, what are you doing?
Charles, do you want to hear something fun about Charles Darwin?
Yeah, I guess.
Listen up.
Almost 200 years ago, a man named Charles Darwin made some incredible discoveries in the field of evolution. In fact, almost everything we believe about evolution roots from the things that Charles found on the Galapagos Islands. Let's take a look into how it went down. In 1831, Darwin set sail to the Galapagos Islands on the boat Beagle. After arriving on the island, Charles sat down on various parts of the islands, watching animal behavior and studying what they looked like. While doing this, he noticed something very interesting. From each island to island, there are different breeds of finches with different shaped beaks. He then pieced together the puzzle and realized that the beaks are specialized for each island, depending on the land and environment that the island has. This makes the beak more advantageous depending on what kind of food the finch eats. Darwin's theories are still very important, and we credit him for coining the word evolution as well as noticing much more about the topic. Here are a few of Darwin's theories that are extremely important today. Darwin theorized that changes occur over time due to naturally occurring variation, that some changes are more advantageous than others, and that nature is at a constant struggle for life. Darwin also argued against creationism and that acquired traits are passed down. Charles Darwin is the most important person when it comes to evolution, and I hope you learned more about him.
We will now take a short message from our sponsors.
Are you tired of being a weak bird with a little beak? You can't pick up any of the nuts, and none of the ladies love you. Well, try this. Natural selection.
Huh.
Boom!
Oh yeah!
You're huge! Look at your beak. You're getting all the nuts.
You like that?
You're getting all the ladies. Natural selection. Chooses the advantageous traits.
Science isn't always about just science. There's one equation you have to remember, the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. The Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is a law that states that allele and genotype frequency in a population of organisms will remain the same from generation to generation without any influence from evolutionary influences. The equation for Hardy-Weinberg is P plus Q equals 1, and P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. Each letter represents a frequency. Right. If all the variables add up to 1, then the Hardy-Weinberg equation is correct. There are some factors that the equation needs to have. To be in Hardy-Weinberg, the population has to be large, and there has to be random mating. Some things Hardy-Weinberg cannot have is natural selection, mutation, and no gene flow. These would cause growth or loss in the population, which would cause an inconsistency in the equilibrium.
"200 years ago, Charles Darwin theorized evolution. But how do we know that guy is right? Well, all around us today, there are hundreds of pieces of evidence that support evolution. Have you ever seen real dinosaur bones in your life? Well, everything that we know about dinosaurs and other ancient creatures comes from these awesome things called fossils. Fossils happen when an animal dies and it gets scrunched up under some rocks and soil. After tons of smushing and pushing, the animal will be perfectly preserved as a fossil. They help us with evolution because we can see their bones and how they relate to each animal that is related to each other. For example, if this lock were an animal and it died, after millions of years, it would get buried in more soil and smushed and pushed. And that's how a fossil is made. A second piece of evidence for evolution is genetics. Inside our bodies, there are millions and millions of little things called DNA that make us who we are. They carry the genetic information that puts us together. By taking different strands of DNA and looking at the information, we can see how animals have evolved. When we were all itty-bitty and in our mothers, we were all little fetuses. And what's amazing about our tiny little bodies is that if I showed you a picture of us, and I showed you a picture of a toad, you could hardly tell us apart. This tells us we evolved from common ancestors. A final piece of evidence are vestigial structures. Have you ever wondered why we have our appendix, or why we can wiggle our ears? Well, thousands of years ago, our ancestors would have needed to use those for important things. For example, cats can move their ears in order to hear better. Now we'll take a look into how we can see evolution around us in this short demonstration.
If all animals came from the same ancestor, how come everything looks so different?
That's a very good question. At the beginning, there was a giant sea full of tons of small organisms. Through billions of years of evolution, natural selection was constantly happening that allowed for small and big changes to occur. All of our genes can be related back to the sea sponge. This is why we're all related. This natural selection didn't get rid of our basic chemical components and origins.
So you're telling me that I'm related to all animals? Even Whiskers here?
Dogs, cats, and most house pets are mammals just like us. But I'm just curious why some animals walk on 4 limbs while we walk on 2.
Well, way back when mammals were still diversifying, they all walked on all 4s. Eventually monkeys and other apes came to be. They evolved to have opposable thumbs, just like us.
Something really easy that we can look at to see similarities between animals is their limb structures. Many animals we see today have a common limb structure that we can use to trace back to common ancestors.
As you can see in this picture, many animals follow the same limb structure of 1 big bone, 2 smaller bones, and lots of small bones.
Oh wow, let's check that out in some common animals.
First off, to examine this, we'll look at humans. As you can see, Kian's arm here follows the limb structure. 1 big bone, 2 smaller bones, and lots of small bones. Now we'll take a look at our friend Whiskers here. 1 big bone, 2 smaller bones, and lots of small bones. And even a canine, like Daisy here, has similar limb structures. 1 big bone, 2 smaller bones, and lots of little bones. In fact, your pets may be a lot more like you than you thought.